The snow had been falling since mid-afternoon. By 9 o'clock it had turned the highway outside Della's diner into something that barely resembled a road. Inside smelled like burnt coffee and frying oil. Country music played low from a corner speaker. The back half of the diner belonged to the Iron Saints, had belonged to them every Thursday night for 12 years, in the quiet, understood way that certain spaces in certain towns belong to certain people. Nobody sat in the Iron Saints section without an invitation. Everyone in Millhaven knew that. Nobody tested it. Ronan Cross sat at the head of the table with a coffee he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. 6'2", gray beard, leather cut covered in patches that told the history of a man who had lived hard and chosen every bit of it. Beside him, Duke Mercer was winning an argument nobody else wanted to be having about carburetor rebuilds. Duke was Ronan's right hand, compact, sharp-eyed, the kind of man whose brain was always running calculations on whatever room he was in. Ronan wasn't listening. He was watching the door. He couldn't explain why. Just that low-frequency alertness that 20 years of chapter leadership had wired into him. Something was about to happen. Then the front door opened and the winter walked in with them. The gust hit hard enough that people flinched. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, both of them coated in snow, holding each other with the grip of people who have been each other's anchor for longer than most people have been alive, were an old man and an old woman. The woman was small, lips the wrong color from cold, wearing a wool coat built for October, not February. The man beside her was tall, once broad, now carrying the permanent stoop of age and weight. He had a flannel shirt, a thin scarf, and the expression of a man who had already been turned away from several places tonight and was measuring whether this one would be different. The woman found a face willing to hold her gaze and said, quietly but clearly, "It's freezing outside. Please, can we stay here a while?" Nobody moved. A man at the counter made a short dismissive sound. The diner owner Pete started moving toward the front with the expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to say. The old man dropped his head and reached for the woman's arm, already retreating, already apologizing, because you could see in his posture that he knew exactly how this ended. He'd seen it enough tonight. Ronan Cross stood up. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood, and the room reorganized itself around that fact. Duke stopped mid-sentence. Pete stopped walking. The man at the counter went quiet. Ronan looked at the couple, then slowly around the room, and said in a voice that was almost conversational, "Anybody got a problem with them staying, they got a problem with us." The diner made its decision in 2 seconds. Travis, the youngest saint at the table, was already pulling a chair. Hatch waved down the waitress. Pete reversed course and went back behind his counter without another word. Mary guided John to the seat. He moved carefully, the stiffness of cold settled deep into old joints. Travis gave them both a grin so earnest it was almost painful. Mary saw it and smiled back despite everything. Ronan sat back down, but his eyes stayed on John. And that was when he saw it. John reached across to take Mary's hand, his sleeve pulled back 2 inches, and on the inside of his left forearm was a tattoo. Old ink, blurred with age, but the shape still legible. A shield. Wings. A unit number. A specific military insignia that didn't belong to just any service branch. It belonged to a specific unit, and if you had reason to know it, you recognized it instantly. Ronan had reason to know it. He went completely still. Duke leaned in, "Boss. You know him?" Ronan said nothing. Duke said, "Ronan." Ronan said, "Not yet. Let me think." And the question that hung invisible in that warm diner, heavier than anything else in the room, was one nobody could answer yet. Why would a man like Ronan Cross go pale at a faded tattoo on the arm of an old man who just walked in from the snow? Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Ronan was beginning to remember about that insignia was about to change everything. Coffee appeared in front of Mary and John without anyone making a formal offer. Eggs and toast followed. A biker named Garrett, big, quiet, missing the top joint of 2 fingers from an old shop accident, sat beside John and found something to say about the snow, which John answered in short polite sentences. John kept his sleeves down. He thanked people when they brought things and looked at the table the rest of the time. Mary thanked everyone twice and apologized once for the inconvenience of their arrival, which made Travis visibly uncomfortable in the way only genuine kindness can make a young man uncomfortable. She held her coffee with both hands like it was the most valuable thing in the room, and every 30 seconds she looked at John, not just checking on him, but holding him together from across the table the way long marriages sometimes work. John barely touched his food. And every time the front door opened, his head came up slightly. Listening. Measuring. The way a man listens when he knows something specific might be coming through that door. Duke pulled Ronan to the back hallway. No car anywhere on the highway shoulder. Travis walked a quarter mile each direction. These people came on foot, in a blizzard, with nothing. That's not a bad night. That's a situation. Ronan nodded. Duke said, the tattoo. Tell me. Ronan said, Vietnam era. 4th Battalion, 9th Infantry. Specific unit. My mother used to talk about a man from that unit. Duke said, is this personal? Ronan said, I don't know yet. But they're not going back out in that storm. Duke said, obviously. And he walked back to the table, because Duke Mercer had never once in 19 years suggested leaving someone in the cold. The questions were stacking with no answers yet. Why were 2 people in their 80s on foot in a blizzard with no destination? Why did John flinch every time the door moved? Why did his jaw tighten when Garrett mentioned a development on Route 9, just making conversation, just filling silence? The truth wasn't going to be a story about hard luck and old age. It was going to be something built deliberately, by someone with resources, and a reason that went back further than anyone in that diner could see yet. If you'd known John and Mary Calloway 10 years ago, you'd have called them the most ordinary people in Millhaven. You'd have been wrong in the best way. They'd lived on Pritchard Street for 41 years, white 2-story, covered porch, garden out back that Mary kept with the same quiet dedication she brought to everything. John had done 12 years in the army before retiring and spending 3 decades running a one-man garage that people drove 2 counties to use. Mary had spent those same decades at the church food pantry, neighborhood fundraisers, quietly being the person a community leans on without ever naming what it's doing. They never had children. They had absorbed that grief a long time ago and redirected it outward, the neighborhood kids, the young mechanics John mentored, the families who needed the pantry in bad months. They were the kind of people towns are built on. The legal letters started 3 years ago. Property notices from a Nashville law firm. John opened the first one at the kitchen table while Mary was outside, read it twice, folded it back, said nothing. By the 4th letter the language had shifted from formal to pressure. He started locking them in the garage. Mary noticed the lock. She didn't ask immediately, she knew John well enough to know he was trying to carry it alone until he understood it. But fear has a smell after 50 years of marriage, and she could smell it on him every time he came in from checking the mail. She just didn't yet know what was causing it. Duke's contacts came through by 11 that night. He stood in the parking lot in the snow and laid it out for Ronan without decoration. John and Mary owned their home outright since 2019, paid off, no liens. 18 months ago, a commercial debt claim was filed against the property going back to 2003. Except John had never been a commercial borrower. He ran a sole proprietorship. The debt on paper belonged to a business entity John had no documented relationship with. The signatures had been added after the fact. The collections process that followed was designed to move faster than any legal challenge could be mounted, each step technically correct on its face, the chain constructed so that by the time an attorney looked at it, the house had already gone to auction and the bank accounts had already been drained through a garnishment order tied to the same fraudulent debt. Duke said, "This wasn't bad luck. Someone engineered this." He paused. The registered agent on every document is the same law firm. That firm's primary client for the past 8 years is a man named Elias Ward. Almost everyone in Central Tennessee knew the name. Elias Ward was 50 years old, well-dressed, and had spent 2 decades building a public image that was essentially armor, the Ward Family Foundation, the hospital pavilion with his name on the wall, the civic center renovation, the charity galas, the speeches about community investment. He was photographed with elected officials. He was called a pillar. He was, by every public measurement, an excellent citizen. Which made what Duke had just described not only criminal but protected. You can only steal from people the way Elias Ward had stolen from the Callaways if no one is looking at you closely enough to see it happening. Ronan went back inside. He sat across from John and waited until the old man actually looked at him. Then he said, "I know about the house." Something behind John's eyes shifted, not relief, something older. The dread of a man who'd been hoping the story wouldn't catch up with him. He said, "Some fights aren't worth the cost to the people who help." Ronan said, "That's not your call to make for us." Then, family doesn't ask permission. John looked at him. And then a set of headlights swept slow across the diner window, a black SUV rolling through the lot at the speed of a vehicle going nowhere, just watching. John's hand went white-knuckled around his mug. Mary went still. Ronan looked at Duke. Duke was already on his feet. The Iron Saints moved Mary and John that same night. Ronan said the word and 20 minutes later the couple was in Hatch's truck with 2 bikes running escort, heading to the chapter's property outside town, a converted barn with heat and a kitchen, large enough for the whole chapter and currently housing none of them. Mary sat on a worn couch with a blanket over her knees and looked around with the expression of someone who has stopped expecting safety and doesn't know how to process it now that it's here. John sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface. Ronan sat across from him and said, "Tell me about Elias Ward." John was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "His father's name was Raymond Ward. In 2002, I was on a military procurement oversight committee the year before I retired. I found irregularities, components marked as delivered that weren't, budget allocations that didn't match any verified purchase order. I wrote a report. I testified under oath. Before the hearing, I was offered a private settlement, $140,000, to withdraw and stay quiet." He paused. "I turned it down. Because the discrepancy involved equipment that soldiers in the field were depending on. That's not something you put a price on." He looked at Ronan steadily. Raymond Ward lost his government contracts. Lost the company. Died 4 years later. His family said it was the stress. Elias was 22 when it started. He watched everything fall apart. Another pause. I understood the math he was doing. I still think I did the right thing. But understanding someone's hatred and being immune to it are two different things. Ronan said, "The black SUV tonight." "How long?" John said, 6 weeks. Different vehicles, same pattern. Slow passes. Sometimes parked across from wherever we were staying. Mary said from the couch, quietly and precisely, he wanted us to know we were being watched. It wasn't about information. It was about making sure John felt like there was nowhere safe to land. Duke came in from outside and pulled Ronan aside. "I've been digging further. The forged signatures on the property filing were notarized by a county clerk who transferred to Georgia 8 months ago. Unusual timing." He paused. "And someone filed a formal records request for John's complete military file 9 months ago, through a law firm. Same firm on all of Ward's documents. There's a page in that file that's listed in the index but missing from the actual records. Someone removed it." Ronan said, "What was on it?" Duke said, "Based on the index notation, it was a supplemental commendation memo. My guess is it documented the settlement offer John refused before testifying. The page that proves his testimony wasn't a personal attack. That he had a choice, and he chose the truth. He let that land. Elias Ward didn't just take their house. He removed the evidence that would have told anyone paying attention why John did what he did. People like Elias Ward count on one thing above everything else, that good people will be too afraid, too isolated, or too exhausted to fight back. If you believe that money and power should not be weapons against innocent people, hit like and subscribe. Because what happens next in this story is what happens when someone finally decides not to stay quiet. The obstacles came fast. A motel on Route 9 turned them away on day 2, every room suddenly full, on a Tuesday in February. A sheriff's deputy showed up at the barn on day 3 asking about a noise complaint that didn't exist, then spent 20 minutes asking pointed questions about the chapter's involvement in local civil proceedings. He came back the next day. On the third visit, Ronan's attorney was present. The visit stopped. An anonymous message arrived through Hatch's phone on day 5, "Stay out of this. Last warning." Hatch photographed it and brought it to Ronan without comment. Ronan read it, set the phone down, and told Travis to call Knoxville. John broke on the 6th night. Quietly, without drama, Ronan found him on the back step of the barn at 2 in the morning, no jacket, staring at the dark field. Ronan sat beside him. After a long while John said, "I spent 30 years believing that doing the right thing was enough. That you paid your cost and it was finished." He stopped. "I won't let good people burn because of something I started." Ronan said, "You don't get to make that trade." John said, "Why does this?" He told John about his mother. About being 8 years old in a diner 40 miles north of Millhaven, in winter, with no money and no plan. His mother trying to hold herself together in front of her son while the owner stood over the table waiting. And a man, older, quiet, grease under his fingernails, who walked over, paid the bill, pulled up a chair, and talked to a frightened boy about motorcycles for half an hour. Who pressed cash into his mother's hand on the way out without making her feel helped. Who left without giving his name. Ronan said, "My mother talked about that man for the rest of her life. She called him the kindest stranger she ever met. I never knew who he was." He looked at John. "Until I saw that tattoo." John stared at him. He said slowly, "I used to do that when I could. I don't remember every time." He stopped. "I remember a woman and a boy. I remember the boy had an old motorcycle magazine he'd been carrying around. Ronan's jaw tightened. He said, "It was the only thing my father left us." John said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, "I'm glad you turned out all right, son." Ronan didn't speak. He nodded once. And the two of them sat together in the cold for a while longer, and nothing else needed to be said. What would you do if you found out the person sitting across from you, a stranger you stepped up to protect, was the same person who showed up for you at the lowest point of your life, decades ago, and never even knew they'd done it? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. Duke tracked down the missing page through a retired records administrator connected to a veterans advocacy network. It took 4 days. The page was a supplemental commendation memo documenting exactly what John had described, including the written record of the settlement offer and John's formal refusal. It had been in the file as recently as 14 months ago. Its removal was logged without explanation, 3 weeks after Ward's law firm submitted the records request. Elias Ward had not only destroyed John's home. He had tried to erase the proof that John's testimony was an act of conscience rather than malice. He had been rewriting the history that made his revenge feel righteous. Ronan made calls. The Iron Saints had chapters in 4 states, and among their members were a retired IRS forensic accountant named Webb and a document examiner in Knoxville named Patrice who had testified as an expert witness in 16 federal cases. Over 10 days they assembled a package: signature comparisons, chain of custody financial mapping, Webb's analysis of the shell company structure, Patrice's formal examination of the forged documents, and the records administrator's sworn statement about the missing page. Ronan sent it to 3 places at once: the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, a financial crimes attorney in Nashville, and an investigative journalist who had covered Elias Ward twice and had always suspected she'd only gotten half the story. Then he told the Iron Saints what they were doing Saturday night. Elias Ward's annual charity gala was held at the Millhaven Civic Center, $500 a plate, for the Ward Family Foundation's Children's Literacy Initiative. Local politicians attended. Business owners attended. The regional press came every year. The event had been running 3 hours when someone on Ward's staff came to him and said quietly that something was happening in the parking lot. Ward excused himself from a conversation with a county commissioner and went outside. 41 motorcycles were arranged in a semicircle around the main entrance. Engines off. Riders standing beside their bikes in the February cold. Not blocking the door. Not making noise. Just present, in the particular way that communicates more clearly than volume ever could. On every windshield was a printed document, a 1-page summary of the allegations, the TBI inquiry number opened 48 hours prior, and a QR code linking to the full documentation package now publicly posted online. Arriving guests were already reading them. The press photographer who had been inside was now outside with her camera up. Mary was in the back of Hatch's truck with a blanket. John stood next to Ronan at the front of the formation. He was very still. Elias Ward came through the doors and stopped. He looked at the motorcycles. He looked at the riders. He looked at Ronan. And then he looked at John Calloway standing beside Ronan, and something in his face, in the managed composure he'd maintained publicly for 20 years, cracked along a fault line that had clearly been under pressure for a very long time. His voice rose in ways that a man of his reputation should not allow in a public parking lot while a photographer stands 15 feet away. 2 board members had followed him outside and were now reading the document on the nearest motorcycle with expressions that were visibly recalculating everything. A longtime gala sponsor stood near the entrance and didn't move, just read. Ward made a brief statement about harassment and misrepresentation and criminal organizations. Then he got into a car and left his own charity event. Which is not what innocent men do. The TBI inquiry escalated to FBI financial crimes within 30 days. The county clerk in Georgia cooperated for a reduced charge. 3 shell companies were frozen. Webb's forensic report left very little room for interpretation. The forged signatures were formally confirmed. The fraudulent lien on the Pritchard Street property was vacated within 35 days of charges being filed. John and Mary Calloway got their house back. John stood on the front porch of his home on a Thursday morning in March and looked at the front door for a long time. Mary was already inside, putting water on for coffee, because that was the first thing she had done in that house every morning for 41 years, and she had not let anyone take it from her permanently. 3 weeks later, Ronan pulled into the driveway on a Sunday afternoon. Just Ronan. Mary made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the same 3 of them, and after a while Ronan reached into his jacket and set something on the table. A patch, the Iron Saints emblem, mounted on a piece of leather the size of a man's hand. He pushed it across to John. He said, "This isn't membership. You're not a biker. But you are family. And we don't say that lightly." Mary and John walked into that diner thinking they were asking for one night out of the cold. They walked out with something they thought they'd lost forever. What's your take on this? Would you have stood up the way Ronan did that night, or would you have looked away? Comment below, I'm reading every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this, check out the previous videos on the channel.